Coming up, a climate emergency protest that shut down the streets of Washington, D.C., and major stories from around the globe. I am Mackenzie Allen Charmley, filling in for Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Thank you for joining us. Aaliyah Chavez is away this week. Indigenous activists want President Biden to declare a climate emergency. The streets surrounding the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. were shut down yesterday in a protest regarding climate change. Hanging from teepee poles, the Indigenous-led blockade is the group ICT Collective. Their goal is to stop future fossil fuel projects that would encourage further entrenchment of violence toward Indigenous communities. ICT Collective is a frontline, direct action group of femme, queer, and two-spirit Black, Indigenous, and queer folks of the global majority organizing in Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. According to the group, protesting was necessary as they, quote, refused to be complicit in the demise of Indigenous communities through colonialism, acknowledging that violence to the land results in violence to Indigenous bodies. The Pope's visit to Canada last week sparked a renewed interest in the Church's collections of Indigenous artifacts. One of the Vatican's museum's least visited collections of artifacts is fast becoming the most contested. The Vatican's Mina Mundi Ethnological Museum houses feathered headdresses, carved walrus tusks, masks, and embroidered animal skins. Indigenous groups are calling for the Vatican to return tens of thousands of Indigenous artifacts and art held by the museums. President of the Métis National Council, Cassidy Kieran, says some of the pieces belong to her people and should be returned. Though a spokesman for the Vatican didn't rule out the Pope repatriating items during his trip, nothing was returned while he was in Canada. There are new developments in lawsuits brought on by Nicholas Sandmann. In 2019, the then 16-year-old Covington Catholic High School student was involved in an incident with Omaha citizen Nathan Phillips. It was in Washington, D.C. at the crossroads between an Indigenous Peoples March and an anti-abortion march. Phillips sang with a hand drum while Sandmann stood close by. The incident was widely viewed on social media and was the cause of the great debate. Sandmann sued several media companies following the incident, alleging they defamed him in their reporting. He was asking for tens of millions of dollars in damages. Then last week, a federal judge threw out the lawsuits, saying the news organization just could not be sued because of First Amendment rights. Sandmann's attorney said they have plans to appeal the decision. She is beloved. She is described as beloved auntie. Last week, Reverend Marlene White Rabbit Helgemo died at age 75. The Ho-Chunk citizen was the first Native woman to be ordained in the Lutheran Church. The state of Minnesota honored her by declaring July 26, 2022 as a day named after her. In addition to being a leader in the Lutheran Church, Helgemo was a co-founder of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She was board president of the American Indian Community Development Corporation of Minneapolis. Helgemo is survived by her spouse Harvey, children, and grandchildren. In North Carolina, a tribal nation is fighting to restore the name of a mountain peak. The mountain is currently called Klingeman's Dome. It is located in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There are new efforts from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians to restore its Cherokee name, Kuahi. In mid-July, the tribal nation voted unanimously at the council meeting to move forward with petitioning the federal government about the issue. Eastern Cherokee people say their people used the mountain as a refuge during the Trail of Tears. Kuahi means mulberry place. Moving forward, the tribal nation says it's working with its Cherokee Speakers Council to decide how to spell the name, given that the Cherokee language has multiple dialects. After they figure the spelling, the Eastern Band of Cherokee will formally apply to have the name changed within the federal government. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, the creative minds behind the new movie Prey, and updates on politics. And later, top news stories from Canada and Australia. Stay with us. Director Dan Trachtenberg and producer Jane Myers of the new movie Prey are the creative minds behind film history. The Predator prequel is the first film to release in the Comanche language. We have them both here today for an exclusive interview with ICT. To start with you, Jane, what was the impact of creating a film that increases the representation of Native cultures in general?
I think it has a great impact because I think it kind of raises the bar for representation. Because not only do you see people in front of the camera, and then you see people like me as the producer behind the camera, but you see people throughout every department because we had an internship program as well. And so sometimes that's when people are trying to get into film, that's all they need is just a foot in the door to get that experience. And then, I mean, from the beginning to the end, to the music, we had other composers that helped with the music. We that worked with our composer Sarah Schachner. We had Robert Mirabal, who is amazing, and then we had Edmund Tate Navakoya, who's Comanche, and he was our music researcher. He even recorded some songs for us, and he also recorded a camp crier. So we added as many elements of authenticity, to really add this to this film.
And Dan, as director, were there any specific themes within the film that you were wanting audiences to take away?
Well, certainly the movie is very much about who is alpha, what is the strongest, what is the true threat, and the answer being adaptability, and it being not what you might think your first perception is a big part of that. And I wanted to make a movie that was a survival tale, and an adventure and action, horror, science fiction mashup, all of those things, but didn't want it to be just an awesome visceral experience. Really wanted it to have an emotional core, and so in thinking about that, wanted to give it the engine of a sports movie, of an underdog story. And thinking about that was like, okay, well, what if the protagonist is not someone that's usually the lead of a movie? And so thinking about Native American, but then even more particularly Comanche, that have often been relegated to playing sidekicks and villains in movies and never really the lead. And so that made this story sort of an obvious one.
Jane, what kind of measures were in place to ensure the historical and cultural accuracy of the film?
Well, we had a lot of measures in place, particularly me being Comanche and being on the set every day and producing this film. I was there to watch everything. I've been involved in the process since the beginning. And that's what's really important because, if there's something wrong with the script or if something needs to be changed, that's where it can be changed. But there's also like really important nuances that can be added when you're in production and you happen to see a scene and something's not just entirely right or working. We were working on the film and we just were like, well, what can make this scene? And I said, oh my gosh, Dan, it's at nighttime. And why don't we have Nadu whistle? And it was like, it was kind of like an iffy thing. And in the middle of shooting, we maybe shot three times. We shot the scene about 3 times without the whistle. And I went running up and I'm like, Dan, remember this is the scene that we should have the whistle. And when Amber did that, and then when we went into post and, looking at it, it's just like, oh my God, that creepy whistle really makes it, because she's like, all out. She said, okay, here we go. I'm totally leveled up. I could care less what comes to get me. And she's using a Frenchman as bait, one of the French trappers, and she whistles. So to me, that's like kind of a defining moment that if you didn't have a Native person on there, would that ever be in the film? it wouldn't have that same kind of significance.
And just to wrap up, do you both have any advice for aspiring Indigenous creatives just trying to get into the industry?
I mean, I would say it's depending on what they're interested in. If it's filmmaking, if it's directing, what have you, I would say never stop making. Make with your friends, make constantly over and over again. And then when you've gotten to a point where that's reached its limit, try reaching out to professionals and making stuff more polished that way, as best and often as you can. But certainly looking for the one foot in the door. The film industry, more so than any other, it's like people hire not based on resume, or it's really based on, hey, Gio, we need this person. Oh, do you know this? Like, it really spreads. Families work in this industry constantly because it's all word of mouth. So it does so much. What Jane has done for the community in Calgary, it's like she's got so many people's foot in the door, and that just spreads. Keep in contact with networks of people and be on the lookout to just get that one foot in. One tiptoe in can really make a difference.
And right now there's so many filmmaking programs that you can get into to have your film made, because sometimes it's budget. And we know all Native films usually start out in their micro budget because we don't have a budget. We all just throw in together and try to make them. I've produced 2 shorts while we've been in post, since we've been back from Canada, helping my friends and working on things. And that's just, just keep working. Dan is totally right. No matter what level you are, you always have to just keep working. And that's what I do. Any way that I can help. Sundance has a good program. Illuminative has a good program. So just apply and try to get your picture made, because the fact that if you can get your content made, that increases our content. Because when people are looking for Native content, we don't have a lot to choose from. So just keep making content.
Well, thank you, Dan and Jane, and we'll be right back. From Canada to Australia, there are Indigenous people all around the globe. ICT's column called Global Indigenous is a weekly roundup of Indigenous news from all over the world. It publishes Wednesday mornings at ictnews.org. Senior editor Diana Hunt oversees the content, and she's back with us for this week's roundup. Hi, Diana.
Hello.
So just to get started, there's big news with the Pope in Canada with his apology. What else can you tell us, and what do we know about that?
It was a 6-day swing through Canada by the Pope. He stopped in the key Indigenous areas, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and repeated again and again the shame that he felt, the apology, the sorrow that he felt for the Catholic Church's role in the Canadian residential school system. He's quite old and he was pretty frail, but he persisted and returned to Rome, to the Vatican, on Saturday. So it was a very groundbreaking trip. And it also left many people in Canada saying, okay, that's good. We're glad he apologized. What's next? What comes next? And that's still to be addressed.
Just to touch on that a little further, just an overview, what do you think the impact overall, positive, negative, was with the Pope's visit?
I think there were generational differences. I think many of the elders were pleased and relieved and in tears to hear finally an apology for the way things were handled and how things happened. And I think that was an important step for the church and for the Pope and for them toward healing. I think the younger generation in general is ready to see more action and less hand-wringing.
In other news, moving on to Bangladesh, one of your headlines came from there. What can you tell us happened?
Yeah, we have, there's a ban in Bangladesh preventing people from entering the world's largest mangrove forest called Sundarbans, and they're trying to protect wildlife and particularly during breeding season. But what's happened is it's cut people out of access to the resources they used to feed their families. And so there's been a number of arrests, 59 arrests in June, from people who were entering the forest, many of whom were trying to feed their families. It's a complicated issue, and it's going to continue to be an issue while this ban goes into effect.
Well, moving on to Australia, I hear that an Indigenous ranger has won some kind of big award.
Yeah, this is a good news story. This is a ranger who has worked in his the Pila Natura Reserve, which was formerly known as the Gibson Desert Reserve. And he work includes fire management, track maintenance. He protects cultural sites, and he's received an award by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature for the work that he has done in his home area. It's a very prestigious. It was handed out in Rwanda, and recognizes the work that those Indigenous rangers are doing quietly in many cases behind the scenes.
There's another additional headline from Australia about the deaths of Aboriginal girls. What do you know and can tell us about that?
This is a sad case. This is a 1987 case in which two girls, young teens, were found dead in what appeared to be a car wreck. There was a person living there. There were some ugly circumstances, and the case was investigated, but there were never any charges filed. And now, this is 34 years later. This case, they have reopened the case. They're going to have an inquest. The suspect, the person of interest, I'm not sure he was ever called formally a suspect. The person of interest died in 2017, but they're looking to bring some closure to the family about what actually happened to these girls. The man who was there at the scene was acquitted of drunken driving charges, and he was also at that point they dropped charges of sexual abuse against him, but the case has never really been resolved to the satisfaction of the families.
Even more in Australia, there is more news about a fertilizer plant. What can you tell us about that?
It was a busy week in Australia last week. The fertilizer plant is it's supposed to go in Western Australia in the Pilbara region, but there are concerns among Indigenous communities there that it's going to threaten some ancient rock art in the area. And so we have some wardens who have filed a request that the work on the plant be halted while they seek a longer moratorium under the federal heritage law in Australia that would allow them to protect those cultural sites while they're challenging the work. So they got a 30-day temporary moratorium while the judge considers the 60-day. And at that point, they're taking it step by step. They're going to work their way through this and see if they can protect those sites. It's a $4.3 billion project. It's a big one.
That's all our time for today, but thank you for being here. It's election season and words mean everything. Take the case of West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. Last week, Manchin announced that he would support the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which used to be called Build Back Better. It includes significant climate, healthcare, and tax policy reforms. In a closely divided House and Senate, Democrats see this as a big win. But is it? Holly Cook-Macaro joins us to break this down. The Red Lake Ojibwe citizen is a partner with Spirit Rock Consulting. Welcome back, Holly.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
So the name has changed, and so has the price it takes. Does President Biden have enough support to get this passed?
Well, at this point, I'm going to back up. For just a week ago, less than a week ago, we thought this bill was completely dead, given Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia's feedback on increasing taxes or any amendments regarding climate change. So it was a surprise to almost everyone on the Hill, even in the Senate, when the deal was struck last Friday. So when Senator Joe Manchin comes along, and when you're in a 50-50 divided Senate, that means you are one closer than you were before, than the day before. So cutting that deal with Manchin, it still remains to be seen whether Kyrsten Sinema, the senator from Arizona, will join with Senator Manchin as the two most centrist Democrats, and a pair that we've heard a lot about in whether legislation passes or not in the Senate. So when she indicates her position, then we'll know whether President Biden has the votes he needs to get the Inflation Reduction Act, or what we have been referring to it as the reconciliation bill for most of this Congress.
So climate change is still front and center on the bill. More specifically, how does Senator Manchin reconcile the wants of his constituents?
Well, that's a great question, and I think probably something that is the subject of the reading of the tea leaves in Washington, D.C. So Senator Joe Manchin, coming from West Virginia, certainly the coal industry is front and center there, and he truly is represents his constituency in the state of West Virginia. So some of these, there are some provisions in there that aren't entirely in line with what we know are the Biden administration's goals on climate change and climate justice. For instance, the increased permitting on oil and gas on some of these very same public lands where they are also aimed to be increasing investments in renewable energy as well. That seems to strike that balance of where Senator Joe Manchin stands and some of the priorities of both the Democratic caucuses in the House and Senate and in the administration.
And Holly, do you believe that these provisions will actually really reduce inflation?
Well, again, that's the reading of the tea leaves. We have, I understand there were some influential economic experts that weighed in with Senator Manchin about the impacts on inflation, which he has been, front and center, his a top concern for him. So that I believe it was Larry Summers who weighed in with him and assured him that these would not increase inflation. So, but again, we'll have to wait and see how these numbers work. Certainly, where we are at with inflation right now is not in line with the predictions were before we had the huge investments through the COVID bills.
What aspects of this massive bill do you think have the support of tribes?
Well, I think everyone is still digesting it, and certainly we are going to want to see what ends up sticking in the bill. I am hearing positive comments about the investment in renewable energy, but also hearing concerns about the expanded opportunities for oil and gas leasing.
And many candidates are facing primary elections today all across the country. One that we're paying attention to is Lieutenant Governor Penny Flanagan, who is in Ojibwe in Minnesota. She's running for re-election with Governor Tim Walz. Her GOP opponent for Lieutenant Governor, Matt Burke, has resorted to name-calling. Do you know what that's all about?
I do. I actually saw the coverage last week. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, who is, America's highest elected Native American official as the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, was making comments in regards to her support for access to reproductive healthcare services for women. And in response, the Lieutenant Governor candidate, Burke, made some comments where he very pointedly says that she savaged him. So, those comments, they're not mistakes. And that in combination with the front runner for the U.S. Senate to win the U.S. Senate GOP primary in Arizona, Blake Masters there, who had some very racist and mocking video of him come out in the last couple of weeks. Those two things, they really impact our community in terms of how we are perceived. We've made such great strides in the last few years about the perception of Native Americans in across the United States and our imagery. Like we've talked a lot about the Renaissance in film and the name change issues. So when you resort to the name calling and the mockery of both, the war paint by Blake Masters, or calling Peggy Flanagan, who is a very proud and visible representative of her Ojibwe culture in the state of Minnesota and nationally, when you use the term savage, that's no mistake. He knows what he's doing, and no matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal or fall somewhere on the spectrum, as Indian people, we have a responsibility to call those things out in order to ensure that our representation and perception is accurate, and we don't allow those things to happen.
Well, Holly, just to conclude our time here, is there anything else that tribes should be looking for as we enter the month?
Well, August has traditionally been the month that the House and Senate go out for recess, but here we are, August 2nd already. It looks like the Budget Reconciliation Act could be on deck by the end of the week. Senator Schumer, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer from New York, has told his colleagues to plan on staying in town over the weekend to consider the Inflation Reduction Act. So it looks like they're going to go a little longer. The House is out. You see Speaker Pelosi is abroad on a number of congressional delegation trips. So I think we will see some action on the Inflation Reduction Act, and then both House and Senate will be out, and they'll come back shortly after Labor Day.
And that's a Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.